While Joni and Doug were walking the sacred streets of Israel, a message was quietly delivered back home, one that Jonathan and Suzy never saw coming. It wasn't just unexpected, it was explosive. The kind of message that changes relationships, raises eyebrows, and demands answers. What did it say? Who sent it? And why now of all times? As Joni's trip unfolded publicly, a private shock hit the family behind the scenes. The ripple effect is just beginning. It was a quiet morning in Montana when Suzy Lamb opened her phone and saw a message that instantly made her heart full. It wasn't dramatic or flashy, just a photo and a few words from a friend who was thousands of miles away. The message came from Rose Howard, a close friend who was visiting Israel. Rose had gone to the Western Wall, one of the holiest places in the world, and while she stood there in prayer, she did something incredibly thoughtful. She wrote down Suzy and Jonathan Lamb's names on a piece of paper and gently placed them into one of the cracks in the ancient wall. Then she prayed over them. To anyone else, it might have just seemed like a sweet gesture, but to Suzy, it was something more. Much more. As she looked at the photo, she could feel the weight of it. Not in a heavy way, but in a deeply emotional one. She said her heart was so full she had to share it. And when she did, the message started to touch others too. Because it wasn't just about names in a wall. It was about timing. It was about connection. It was about God reminding them He hadn't forgotten. At that very moment, Joni Lamb and Doug Weiss were also in Israel on a highly publicized trip that included meetings with Israeli leaders like Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The Daystar Network was using the trip to highlight the spiritual bond between Christians and the land of Israel. But while the cameras were rolling in one part of the country, something unseen was happening elsewhere. Something quiet, personal, and deeply spiritual. That's what made it all feel so significant. While the leaders of Daystar were representing the ministry in Israel, Jonathan and Suzy's names were being lifted up in private prayer at the exact same time, in the exact same land. It didn't feel random. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like God was moving behind the scenes. For Suzy, it brought back a memory she hadn't thought about in a long time. Back in 2017, she and Jonathan had traveled to Israel together. They were still early in their marriage, and she was 4 months pregnant with their first child. During that trip, Jonathan had taken a moment to write a personal prayer at the Western Wall, a covenant letter to God. He asked the Lord to guide his life, to order his steps, and to help him stay in God's perfect will. That prayer, written on September 12, 2017, marked a turning point in Jonathan's walk with God. But the moment didn't stop there. While they were still in Israel, they made another decision, one that seemed simple at the time, but now feels deeply prophetic. They chose to name their unborn son Israel. At the time, it just felt right. But now, looking back, Suzy says they had no idea how powerful that choice would become. Years later, as they faced heartbreak, conflict, and spiritual challenges, that name, Israel, became a reminder that God had been guiding their story all along, that He had seen the future, that He had plans for their family, long before they knew what was coming. So when Rose sent that photo from the wall, placing their names once again into the cracks of the stone, it felt like a full circle moment, like God whispering, "I haven't changed. My mind, I still see you. I'm still working." In a season where so much has felt broken, family relationships, ministry roles, trust, this one simple act of prayer lit something up again. It didn't solve everything. It didn't erase the pain. But it stirred hope. It reminded Jonathan and Suzy that they're still part of a bigger story, and that, even when things feel uncertain, God is still weaving all the pieces together. Sometimes, the loudest move of God doesn't come through headlines or big speeches. Sometimes it comes through a quiet prayer whispered in the cracks of a wall, halfway around the world. And that's exactly what happened on that Montana morning. God moved, softly but surely, and hearts were reminded that even in the silence, He is still speaking. When Jonathan and Suzy Lamb walked away from Daystar, it wasn't just a career move. It was a heartbreak. It was the end of something they had poured their hearts into for years. From the outside, it looked like they had it all: ministry influence, a respected last name, a platform that reached millions. But behind the scenes, things were breaking. Quietly at first. Then, all at once. Leaving Daystar wasn't part of their plan. It wasn't something they woke up one day and decided to do. It came after months of tension, inner conflict, and trying to hold on when it felt like everything was pulling them apart. They were part of the inner circle, tied to the leadership by name, blood, and years of service. But when they started to question decisions, when they started to ask hard questions about what was happening around them, things shifted. Jonathan, especially, began to feel the weight of his role. He had grown up around Daystar. It wasn't just his workplace, it was his world. And now, that world was no longer safe. Suzy, watching her husband carry the burden of legacy and expectation, knew something had to change. The pressure was building from all sides, spiritually, emotionally, even physically. And then came the moment when they knew they had to let go. It didn't happen quietly. Their departure from Daystar was fast and public. One day they were in front of the cameras doing ministry. The next, they were gone. No grand farewell, no official blessing, just silence. And in some corners, even suspicion. For a while, they didn't know what to say. They didn't know how to explain what had happened. There were things they couldn't talk about yet, things they were still trying to process themselves. But deep down, they knew they had made the right decision. So they packed up their life in Texas and moved to Montana. Montana wasn't just a change of scenery. It was a lifeline, a chance to breathe again, a place to be anonymous, to slow down, to start over. There were no cameras, no stages, no pressure to perform or lead or prove anything. Just quiet, mountains, mornings that started with coffee instead of meetings, nights that ended in prayer instead of emails. One of the first things they did was find a church. Not a flashy one, just a place where they could sit, worship, and heal. They didn't walk in as the lambs. They walked in as a young couple looking for peace. And that's exactly what they found. A community that didn't care about their last name or their past. A place that welcomed them not because of who they had been, but because of who they were. Hurting, hopeful, and hungry for God. During those early months in Montana, they didn't try to launch a new ministry. They didn't chase after a new platform or try to fix what had been broken. They rested. They prayed. They cried. They got outside. They laughed with their kids. They let God do the deep work of healing, the kind that doesn't come with applause, but is more important than any stage. They started sharing small things online, not big messages or dramatic updates, just honest reflections. Scriptures that had been helping them, thoughts on faith, family, and what it means to trust God when life falls apart. They didn't post for attention. They posted because they couldn't stay silent about how faithful God was being to them, even in the valley. And slowly, people started to notice, not because they were trying to build an audience, but because their story was relatable. Their honesty was refreshing. In a world where so many leaders pretend to have it all together, Jonathan and Suzy were saying, "We're figuring it out too. We've been hurt too, but we're still here. And so is God." They didn't hide their pain, but they didn't wallow in it either. They let it be what it was, a part of the story. A chapter, not the end. And, through that, they began to rebuild not the ministry they once had, but a deeper foundation for who they were becoming. Some days were still hard. Some memories still stung. There were unanswered questions, broken relationships, moments of doubt. But through it all, there was also peace. Not the kind the world gives, but the kind that only comes when you know God is in the middle of the mess with you. In Montana, they found that. They found God again in the quiet, in the ordinary, in the spaces where no one was watching. And that kind of rebuilding, it doesn't happen overnight. It's slow, sacred, stronger than what came before. They could have disappeared. They could have let the weight of what happened crush their spirit. But instead, they chose to rebuild. With humility, with faith, and with a quiet confidence that the story isn't over. Not even close. Montana may be far from the spotlight, but for Jonathan and Suzy Lamb, it's where something beautiful is being restored. And while the world watches and wonders what's next for them, they're already living the answer, day by day, step by step, heart by healed heart. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing about control. It creeps in slowly. At first it just looks like structure, leadership, and order. You tell yourself it's normal, that every ministry has rules, every team has expectations. But for Jonathan and Suzy Lamb, what started as respect for leadership eventually turned into something much more painful. and much more dangerous. They didn't go into Daystar with fear in their hearts. In fact, they went in with hope. Jonathan, the son of Marcus and Joni Lamb, had grown up inside the walls of the ministry. It wasn't just his job, it was his heritage. Suzy, bright and passionate, was ready to serve alongside her husband, sharing the gospel, building the kingdom. They believed in the mission. They believed in the people. But over time, things started to feel different. At first, it was small things, decisions that didn't quite make sense, conversations that felt more like commands, expectations that shifted without warning. But when they asked questions, they weren't met with answers, they were met with silence, or worse, pressure. It wasn't open dialogue, it was fall in line or fall out. There was one voice, they say, that seemed to rise above all others: Joni Lamb. To the public, she was a woman of faith and leadership. To those inside, her voice became law. Jonathan and Suzy started to notice how her words weren't just suggestions, they were treated like divine direction. To disagree wasn't just uncomfortable, it was seen as rebellion. To challenge her opinion was to risk being seen as disloyal, and disloyalty in that environment was not tolerated. As time went on, the pressure built. The expectations weren't just about doing your job, they were about showing unwavering support, no matter what. Jonathan began to feel it deeply. As the son of Daystar's founders, he was expected to toe the line, to support decisions even when they didn't sit right in his spirit. And when he didn't, the consequences came quickly. One moment stands out in their memory like a scar. They were asked to read a comment on air during a live broadcast. It was a glowing endorsement of Johnny's recent marriage to Doug, a controversial decision that had already stirred up concern in Christian circles. The comment had clearly been hand-picked, strategically chosen to send a message of public support. Jonathan felt it wasn't honest. He didn't want to be a part of it. And when he refused to read it, everything changed. That simple act of quiet conviction was treated like betrayal. It wasn't just that he declined, it was that he didn't fall in line. Not long after, both he and Suzy were removed from their positions. No explanation, no grace, just gone. It didn't feel like a resignation, it felt like an exile. And what followed was even worse. Behind the scenes, they say there were efforts to discredit them, to intimidate them, to silence them. People they once trusted turned cold. Rumors started to spread. They felt watched, judged, and pushed out. Not just of the ministry, but of the community they once called home. They weren't just losing jobs, they were losing relationships, family ties, spiritual mentors, and at the heart of it all was a culture of fear. A culture where people didn't speak up because they were afraid of being next. A culture where the leader's voice was held up higher than God's word. A culture where spiritual authority was used not to lift people up, but to keep them in line. Jonathan and Suzy didn't want to believe it at first. They tried to reason through it, pray through it. But eventually they had to face the truth. What they were experiencing wasn't just leadership conflict. It was spiritual abuse, the kind that doesn't leave bruises on your body, but scars on your soul. They talk about moments where they didn't feel safe in their own home. Moments where they looked over their shoulders, unsure of who was watching, who was reporting back. It wasn't paranoia. It was the reality of what they were living through. A ministry that preached love and truth, but behind closed doors, was operating with control and silence. For a while they stayed quiet, not because they wanted to hide, but because they needed to heal. They needed time to figure out what had really happened and how to move forward without bitterness. They didn't want revenge. They didn't want drama. They just wanted freedom. When they finally started to speak out, they didn't name names with hate. They told their story with honesty. They didn't scream, they shared. They didn't accuse, they explained. But make no mistake, their story was heavy, and it touched something that many others have felt but never had the words to say. Spiritual abuse is real, and it doesn't always come in the form of yelling or obvious manipulation. Sometimes it's quiet, it's hidden under scriptures and smiles, it's wrapped in prayers and policies, but it's still abuse. And it leaves people questioning their faith, their worth, their place in the church. Jonathan and Suzy aren't trying to tear anyone down. They're trying to shine a light, not for vengeance, but for healing. They've chosen to use their voice, not to shame, but to help. Because for every person who's brave enough to tell the truth, there are 100 more still sitting in silence, too scared to speak. They want people to know that Jesus is still good, even if some of his people have caused pain. That ministry doesn't have to look like control. That real leadership doesn't demand loyalty, it earns trust. That the Holy Spirit brings freedom, not fear. Their story is a warning, yes, but more than that, it's a testimony. A testimony that you can walk through spiritual trauma and still come out with your faith intact. That you can lose your place, but not your purpose. That you can be pushed out and still find God waiting for you on the other side. Jonathan and Suzy Lamb didn't ask for the battle they went through. But now that they've walked it, they're using it to bring truth, to spark healing, to start a new chapter, one not written in fear, but in freedom. And that, in the end, may be the most powerful ministry of all. Something in the air has shifted. People who've been following Jonathan and Suzy Lamb's story closely can feel it. There's a quiet hum beneath the surface, like the calm before something big. Maybe it's the timing. Maybe it's how all the pieces are starting to line up. Or maybe it's God preparing to turn the page. After everything they've been through, the exit from Daystar, the silence, the heartache, the rebuilding in Montana, you'd expect them to disappear, to shrink back, take a break, and never look back. And truthfully, no one would have blamed them if they did. But Jonathan and Suzy aren't wired that way. At their core, they've always been about one thing: following the call of God, even when it costs them everything. And now, for the first time in a long while, people are beginning to wonder, is something new coming? Could God be writing a brand new chapter for them? One that no man, no network, no broken system can control? It's not hard to imagine. The signs are subtle, but they're there. It started with the trip to Israel, though Jonathan and Suzy weren't the ones who went. Joni Lamb and her new husband, Doug Weiss, were the ones pictured at the Wailing Wall and meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. But while that public trip played out, something quiet and powerful was happening behind the scenes. Jonathan and Suzy received a message from a friend in Israel, someone who had visited the Western Wall and placed their names into the ancient stones, praying over them. It was a simple gesture, but it landed like lightning. At the exact time that Daystar leadership was walking the streets of Jerusalem, Jonathan and Suzy's names were being spoken in prayer in the holiest place in Israel. That's not coincidence, that's providence. And it stirred something, not just in their hearts, but in the hearts of people watching. Because those who've known them, supported them, and prayed for them since their painful departure from Daystar have held on to a quiet hope that one day Jonathan would return, not just to the network, but to the calling that was written into his DNA from the beginning. Not as a puppet, not as someone's shadow, but as a leader, a restorer, a voice for a new generation. Jonathan Lamb grew up in ministry. He didn't just inherit the Daystar name, he lived it. He watched his parents build it from the ground up. He watched his father preach with fire and passion. He watched his mother become the face of a network that reached millions. And for years, he served faithfully behind the scenes and in front of the cameras. But there was always something deeper in him. A vision that wasn't about shows or ratings, but about real people, real faith, and real transformation. It was quiet at first, buried under the weight of expectation and tradition. But now, that quiet vision is growing louder. You can see it in the way he carries himself, in the way he speaks, in the way he and Suzy have stayed faithful even when no one was looking. Suzy, too, has become a force of her own. Through their journey, she's shown incredible strength and grace. She's spoken truth without bitterness. She's offered hope when she could have chosen silence. And more than anything, she's stayed rooted in her calling as a wife, a mother, and a minister of the gospel. Together, they've walked through the fire and come out stronger, not harder, not colder, but clearer. That's why people are watching closely now. Because when God starts aligning things in the spirit, it usually means something is about to break loose in the natural. And, as strange as it may seem, that quiet prayer at the Western Wall might have marked the beginning of something divine. Could this be the moment God starts to restore what was broken? Could he be preparing to launch Jonathan and Suzy into something entirely new? Not a return to the old, but a rebirth into something that reflects the heart of Jesus more clearly than ever. They haven't made big announcements, they're not out there campaigning or chasing platforms, but maybe that's exactly why they're ready. The world doesn't need another celebrity preacher, it needs leaders who've been broken, humbled, and rebuilt by the hand of God. And that's what Jonathan and Suzy represent now. They're not bitter former staff. They're not victims. They're vessels. Everything they've walked through has refined them. The spiritual abuse, the intimidation, the fear, it didn't destroy them. It woke them up. It forced them to look in the mirror and ask, what kind of leaders do we really want to be? And now they are answering that question not with speeches, but with their lives. With their quiet obedience. With their willingness to wait on God's timing, no matter how long it takes. There's been talk, among friends, among viewers, even quietly inside the Daystar circle, that perhaps it's time for a change, that maybe Jonathan was meant to lead all along, that maybe the ministry's future doesn't rest in what's flashy or popular, but in what's faithful and rooted in truth. Whether they return to Daystar or build something completely new, one thing is clear: the mantle on their lives hasn't lifted, it's matured, and it's waiting for the right moment to rise again. In Montana, they've found healing. They've found stillness, but they've also found strength. And the calling hasn't gone anywhere. If anything, it's clearer now than it's ever been. Could a new chapter be coming? It's hard to say when or how. But if you listen closely to the timing, the signs, the prayers being whispered in sacred places, it certainly seems like heaven is getting ready to turn the page. And when it does, it won't be about reclaiming titles. It'll be about reintroducing purpose. A new chapter for Jonathan and Suzy might not look like the one they thought they'd live, but it just might be the one they were born to write.